I'm Gary DeMar, and this is the second installment in a brief series I'm doing on eschatology and apologetics. Apologetics is the defense of the Christian faith, and the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 says that we should always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks us about the hope that is within us. And oftentimes apologetics comes down to answering specific objections to the Christian faith. And in terms of eschatology, we know that Jesus made certain predictions about when he was going to come. You can find this in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, Matthew 16, 27 through 28, and in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, where he says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." When I was a new Christian, I became a Christian in 1973. I was a senior at Western Michigan University and came across a high school friend who presented the gospel to me. And this was in the heyday of the late great Planet Earth. The late great Planet Earth was a book written by Hal Lindsey, published by Zondervan Publishing House. And in that book, Hal Lindsey said that Israel becoming a nation again in 1948 was prophetically significant. And that Jesus said, "This generation will not pass away until all these things took place." And the generation was 40 years. And therefore, within 40 years of 1948, something called the rapture of the church would take place, in which the church would be taken off the earth. And then following the so-called rapture, there would be a 7-year period in which there would be 3.5 years of peace. And then in the middle of the 7-year period, the Antichrist, unknown as the Antichrist prior to this great tribulation that was to follow, would make a covenant with Israel, and then would break the covenant, and literally all hell would break loose during this period of time. But as I read the Gospel of Matthew, I came across a few passages that didn't seem to fit with what Hal Lindsey was saying. And being a new Christian and not knowing much about the Bible, I really didn't know how to answer the objections. And this was especially true when I got to Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, about this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And so what has happened is that critics of the Bible have pointed to Jesus' supposed failure to predict his own coming. That Jesus said he would return before that generation passed away, and they claim that Jesus didn't return before that generation passed away. And as a result, Christians have tried to use all sorts of exegetical gymnastics to get the passage of Scripture to say what they needed to say. And I covered that in the first lesson. And I came across an article online as I was researching something else, and it was called "Black Non-Believers Incorporated, Walking by Sight, Not by Faith." And the author of this article states, and the title of it is "Jesus' Failed Prophecy About His Return." And he writes, "The fact that Christianity started as a Jewish apocalyptic movement is evidenced by the teachings of the biblical Jesus concerning the end of the days. Not only did he preach he would rise from the grave, but that he would also ascend to the heaven and one day return to judge and rule over the world. When did Jesus say his return would be? While he said no one, including himself, knew the exact time of his return, he knew it would be before the end of his generation." And this author is right. Jesus said he would return before that generation passed away. And the question remains, was Jesus right or wrong? If Jesus was wrong about his return, if he did not return before that generation passed away, then he is a false prophet, and he comes under the sanction of Deuteronomy 18, and we would have to dismiss everything he said in the gospel accounts, because if we can't trust him on this very large section of Scripture, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, then why should we trust him on anything else he says? So this particular critique of what Jesus has to say is a very good critique in this sense. It points out the flaws among many prophecy writers today, and many people who believe these prophecy writers, that Jesus wasn't predicting that he would become in that particular generation, that he wouldn't return within that generation. Jesus was really talking about his second coming, something that hasn't happened yet. As I pointed out, you can't make that case. There is no doubt that Jesus had that particular generation in mind. There are no exceptions to this. This generation always means the generation to whom Jesus is speaking. In order to make his case against what Jesus has to say about this, he has a number of scripture passages. The first one is one I encountered when I started reading Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 16, verses 27 through 28. For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is pretty evident that Jesus is talking about that particular group of people. And he was saying that some of you are going to still be alive when I come in judgment. Now, unless you try to manipulate this particular passage, as some do, Jesus had to have come in some capacity before the last person in this group died. And if that isn't the case, then Jesus was mistaken. And there are a couple of ways that people try to get around the clear statement of Jesus. The first is to say, well, this Jesus was talking about the transfiguration, which occurred about a week to 10 days later. That's impossible. Nobody in this group had died within that period of time. The only event that's far enough in the future that this would take place, where some of the people would still be alive, would be the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which was a judgment coming of Jesus. But there are even some who maintain that John is still alive today, to try to force this particular passage to apply to a future generation, the future coming of Christ that hasn't happened yet. That Jesus still is alive, that John is still alive somewhere in the world today. The person who advocates this particular position is a fellow named David Nolan, and it's in his book, Israel in Crisis, and I'm going to quote from page 143. He says, in further non-biblical research, I discovered that many early church authorities believed that Jesus had never died. Now, he doesn't offer any evidence to this. I would like to see what research he came up with. This was based on the Lord's mysterious words in John 21, and also on the fact that, unlike the other apostles, no credible account exists about his death. I suspect that may be because John did not die. Now, this is the extremes that people have to go to get around what Jesus was saying about when he would return. And it's crazy. Take Jesus at his word. He said he was going to return before that generation passed away, and he did return before that generation passed away. Now, think about this among the early church who were copying the original copies of the gospel accounts, who came across these passages. Say they made copies post AD 70, after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Don't you think they would have fixed what Jesus said if they believed he was in error about this? Why wouldn't they have put a more futuristic cast to Jesus' words? They didn't. And the reason they didn't is because they took Jesus at his word, that this applied to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's self-evident. Same thing is true of commentators throughout history who've written commentaries on Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. They applied the Olivet Discourse to Jesus's return in that particular generation. Part of the problem that the author of the Jesus's failed prophecy about his return make is they don't understand Old Covenant language in the Old Testament, how the Bible applies judgment comings and uses judgment themes, coming in judgment, coming down to Egypt. God's riding on a cloud and he comes to Egypt and the idols tremble at his presence. Obviously, God didn't come down on a cloud to Egypt. It's that language is just typical of the way you describe God coming in judgment. The same in Micah chapter 1, where God comes down and the mountains melt like wax before a fire. This language is just typical of the Old Testament. It's unfortunate that this particular author doesn't understand that. And it's also unfortunate that a lot of Christians and a lot of Christian prophecy writers don't understand it either. So we'll get into this in more detail, some of the other passages, and how you as a Christian, using an apologetic methodology, can answer the critics regarding the soon coming of Jesus Christ, the coming that was to take place before that particular generation in Jesus' day passed away.